I'd been driving for hours. The GPS had long lost signal, leaving me navigating on instinct, which admittedly was as shaky as the old truck I was driving. There wasn't a house, a sign, or even another vehicle in sight, just mile after mile of dense looming trees, their branches twisted and arched over the road, blocking what little moonlight was left. The air felt thick, almost solid, as if it was pressing in on me, suffocating, and my headlights barely seemed to scratch the surface of the dark. Then I saw it. A light, faint and flickering, like an old lantern through the mist and shadows. My heart leapt at the sight, a strange blend of relief and dread coiling in my stomach. I couldn't ignore the gut feeling telling me to keep driving, but I was too far gone to turn back now. I had to find help. The light came from a small, dilapidated cabin that looked as if it had clawed its way out of the forest, barely standing under the weight of years of rot and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged like it could collapse at any second. But that light was still there, flickering behind the dirty, broken glass. It wasn't much, but it was enough to lure me in. I pulled up close to the cabin and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, watching my own breath fog up in the chilly air. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my desperation overruled my better judgment. Stepping out, I was hit by the smell. Thick, earthy, with a hint of something foul, something decaying. Each step toward the cabin felt heavier than the last. I knocked on the door, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I reached for the doorknob, expecting it to be locked, but it twisted under my hand with a rusty groan. The door swung open, revealing a room cloaked in shadows. My eyes strained to adjust, catching glimpses of what lay beyond. Dust-covered furniture sat motionless, as if frozen in time, and cobwebs draped every corner. The place was abandoned, or it should have been. I took a step inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The smell was stronger here, almost nauseating. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a single chair pulled back from an old wooden table, like someone had just been sitting there, and beside the chair, a book lay open on the floor, its pages spread like wings. I stared at it, the hairs on my neck prickling. Whoever was here had left in a hurry. I moved closer, crouching down to pick up the book. As I did, I noticed something else. A faint, dark stain beneath the chair, a patch of wood slightly darker than the rest. I swallowed, a creeping feeling slithering through my veins. It looked like blood. Old and faded, but unmistakably blood. I stood up quickly, scanning the room again. The shadows felt deeper, pressing in around me, suffocating. I wanted to leave, but something held me there, like an invisible hand gripping my shoulder, urging me to stay. I was about to turn, when a faint creak echoed through the silence. My heart stopped. The noise had come from the far corner of the room, where a door stood slightly ajar, leading into the darkness. My eyes were fixed on that doorway, my breath caught in my throat. Then the door creaked open further, inch by inch, revealing nothing but pitch black beyond. I could feel something watching me from the other side. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming for me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. A shadow shifted in the darkness beyond the door, moving slowly, deliberately. I backed away, my hands fumbling to find something, anything to defend myself with. My fingers brushed against the chair, and I grabbed it, lifting it between myself and whatever was lurking into the shadows. Then, from the darkness, I heard it. A low, raspy whisper, barely audible, but enough to send chills racing down my spine. It was calling my name. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the table behind me. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, repeating my name over and over, each word dripping with malice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to get out of there, now. I turned and bolted for the door, my feet pounding against the creaky floorboards. The whisper followed me, echoing through the cabin, growing louder with each step. I burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind me, and sprinted toward my truck. Fumbling with the keys, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing at the doorway. But there was nothing, just the empty, desolate cabin, and the faint light flickering in the window, casting eerie shadows against the boarded-up glass. I got in the truck, started the engine, and tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the dark road. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I didn't dare look back, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every shadow on the road, every flicker of movement in the trees felt like it was watching me, waiting. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the cabin was nothing but a distant memory. But even now, in the dead of night, when everything is silent, I can still hear it. That whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from somewhere in the darkness. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that cabin, standing alone in the woods, waiting for me to return. I still remember that weekend like it was yesterday, and I still get chills just thinking about it. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a quick getaway from the noise of the city. Just me and my friends, Jake, Ryan, and Matt, looking for a little adventure out in the wild. We got there late in the afternoon. The sky was a blaze of oranges and pinks, and the air was crisp, with that earthy smell you only find deep in the woods. We quickly set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and built a fire. By the time we finished, night had settled over us, the fire casting shadows that danced around our little campsite. Jake was the one who suggested we go looking for the waterfall. He'd read about it online. Supposedly it was hidden somewhere deep in these woods, like a secret treasure only a few had ever found. We were all feeling adventurous, so we grabbed our flashlights, cracked a couple of jokes about Bigfoot, and headed into the trees. At first, it was fun. The excitement of the unknown kept us moving, and we laughed, not taking anything too seriously. But as we walked, the laughter died down. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing thicker and taller, their branches intertwining above us like a tangled web. I started to notice how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor. We kept walking, and eventually I had to admit to myself that I wasn't sure which way we'd come from. It was hard to tell in the dark, and the trail was barely a trail at all, more like a narrow, winding line of trodden-down undergrowth. But Jake was ahead, his flashlight bobbing up and down, and I didn't want to be the one to back out, so we pressed on. It was Ryan who first admitted that he thought we were lost. He stopped, looked around, and said, "Are we sure this is the right way?" His voice sounded small in the vastness of the forest, and that's when I felt it, the first inkling of fear creeping up my spine like cold fingers. Jake insisted he knew where we were going, but even he didn't sound as confident as he had back at the campsite. The trees felt closer, their branches like claws stretching out towards us. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, filled with the smell of damp earth and rotting wood. After a while, we realized we'd completely lost the trail. I could feel the panic starting to bubble up, and judging by the silence from the others, I knew they were feeling it too. Every direction looked the same, a dark, endless wall of trees. We tried turning back, retracing our steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest seemed to shift around us, like it was playing some twisted game. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, our flashlights started to flicker. First Jake's, then mine, then Matt's. The beams grew weaker, sputtering, until they went out completely, leaving us standing in pitch darkness. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that. We were completely lost, swallowed by the night, surrounded by an endless stretch of trees that seemed to be watching us. Waiting. That's when we saw it. A faint light, flickering in the distance. It was barely visible, like a tiny flame wavering in the darkness. We all saw it at the same time, and without a word we started moving towards it, our breaths shallow and our footsteps frantic. As we got closer, we realized it was a lantern hanging from a low, twisted tree branch. The light cast eerie shadows across the ground, making the branches look like skeletal fingers clawing at the earth. And then we saw the figure. It was standing beneath the lantern, half hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline, a tall, slender shape, standing perfectly still, like it was waiting for us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. None of us spoke. We just stared, frozen, unable to look away from that shadowy figure. It felt like we were caught in a nightmare, and I kept waiting to wake up, to find myself back at the campsite, safe and warm by the fire. But this was real. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. And then slowly, it raised an arm, pointing deeper into the woods. I don't know why, but we followed. It was like we were under a spell, drawn to that silent figure and the path it was pointing us down. We walked for what felt like hours, the figure always just a few steps ahead, leading us through the dark. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches scratching at our arms and legs, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. It was like we were being pulled forward, deeper and deeper into the forest, unable to resist. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The light from the lantern flickered once, then died, leaving us in total darkness once again. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like something growling deep in its throat. It came from somewhere behind us, close enough that I could feel the vibrations in my chest. We turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like an eternity. The darkness pressing in on us from all sides, the growling getting closer, louder, more frenzied. Finally, we stumbled out of the trees and into a clearing. I looked around, my heart racing, and realized we were back at the campsite. The fire was still burning, crackling softly in the night, like we'd never left. None of us spoke. We just sat down around the fire, breathing hard, our eyes wide and wild. I don't know what we saw out there, or what led us back. All I know is that we barely made it out of those woods, alive. To this day, I can still hear that growling in my nightmares, still see the shadowy figure standing beneath the lantern, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can feel it watching me, just beyond the edge of the light. I had never been the type to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, none of it ever fazed me. But that was before the night I found myself stranded on a desolate highway, with nothing but darkness around me and something unknown watching from the shadows. It started like any other night. I'd been visiting a friend out of town, but our conversation had stretched on well into the early hours of the morning, and I'd ended up hitting the road far later than planned. The highway stretched on in front of me, a single dark line cutting through the bleak desert landscape. The radio was dead, replaced only by the hum of my engine and the crunch of tires on asphalt. After an hour or so, I began to realize how isolated I was. I hadn't seen another vehicle in what felt like miles. The occasional comforting glimmer of taillights or headlights was nowhere in sight. The night closed in around me, deepening the silence until it was absolute. Then, out of nowhere, my car stuttered. The engine coughed once, twice, and then completely died, coasting me to a slow stop right in the middle of nowhere. I tried to start it again, but the engine just groaned, refusing to turn over. My phone was nearly dead, with no signal, and as the seconds ticked by, the silence grew oppressive. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, each beat reminding me just how alone I was. I debated my options. I could stay in the car and wait, though for what I had no idea. Or I could start walking, hoping to find some sign of life on this God-forsaken road. The mere thought of stepping out into that darkness, though, made my skin crawl. It was then that a prickle of unease started at the base of my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I rolled up my windows and locked the doors, as if that would actually protect me from, well, from what? There was nothing out here, just me, my broken-down car, and the vast, empty expanse of the highway stretching endlessly in both directions. And then I saw it, a distant light, a pair of headlights slowly approaching in my rear-view mirror. Relief flooded me. I flashed my lights and waved my arm out the window, hoping they'd notice. As the vehicle drew closer, I could make out the shape of an old beat-up pickup truck, its rusty body clunking as it came to a halt behind my car. The driver was a shadowed figure, obscured by the dim glow of his dashboard, but as I stepped out of my car, I felt a chill. Something wasn't right. The way he looked at me, eyes hard and calculating, gave me a sense of dread that I couldn't quite place. His face was hidden under a greasy baseball cap pulled low over his brow, and even though he was offering help, every instinct I had screamed at me to stay away. "Car trouble?" His voice was low, a rough growl that made my skin prickle. Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Engine just died out here, but I already called for help." It was a lie, a poor one at that, but I hoped it might convince him to keep driving. The man smirked, one corner of his mouth lifting in a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't get many cars breaking down on this stretch," he said, his tone more curious than sympathetic. "Odd for an engine to give out all of a sudden, don't you think?" I forced a laugh, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Yeah, bad luck, I guess. Anyway, thanks for stopping, but I'll be fine." He looked me up and down, a cold, predatory glint in his eyes. He didn't drive off, just sat there, staring, like he was sizing me up. My heart hammered, and I took a small step back toward my car. Then, without another word, he rolled up his window, shifted his truck into gear, and drove off, leaving me alone once again on the deserted highway. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As the red glow of his taillights disappeared down the road, a new sense of dread began to creep in. I got back in my car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel, staring down the road in the direction he'd gone. But the darkness swallowed everything, leaving me in suffocating silence. That's when I noticed a shape in the darkness, a figure just outside my window. My heart stopped. I didn't even have time to react before there was a loud bang on my window, the glass rattling in its frame. The figure outside didn't move, just stood there, unmoving, a dark silhouette against the night. I held my breath, hoping it was some trick of the light or my own imagination. But it wasn't. Whoever, or whatever it was, stood perfectly still, face obscured in shadow, one hand pressed against my window. My mind raced. There had been no sound, no footsteps, just the sudden bone-chilling presence of this stranger outside my car. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I slowly reached for the ignition, hoping my car would somehow miraculously start. I turned the key. Nothing. Just a dull click and the whir of a dead battery. The figure outside remained still, watching. With no other options, I slid my phone from my pocket, praying for even a sliver of signal. But the screen was dark. The battery drained to nothing. I was truly, completely alone. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, melting back into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, frozen, until I finally mustered the courage to glance around. There was nothing, just empty road and the desolate landscape around me. But as I looked down the highway, my blood turned to ice. In the distance, barely visible, I saw two pinpricks of light, a pair of headlights, approaching steadily, slowly. The same truck, the same driver. And I knew, in that instant, that whatever he had planned, he wasn't done with me yet.